Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Serious, what have you seen in the woods that you can't explain? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And go ahead and hit that notification bell too. Thanks. A really old, strangely suburban looking house on a small hill right in the middle of the forest. Me and my friends went inside and the place looked like it had just been suddenly abandoned. There was furniture still in place, cutlery and plates in the cupboards, and in the chest of drawers upstairs there were old clothes, still apparently clean. One closet we looked in contained old comics and newspapers from the 60s and 70s. This was about 1993. Round the back of the house was an old 1960s style truck just rusting away. Who had lived there, and why did they leave so suddenly? Who knows? I was hiking up in the mountains. I was on a relatively steep spot and could hear a thump underground, and I could see no holes or entrances. I heard it several times. I figured it was some animal, a la burrowing, but never figured out what it was. Another was when I was driving through a wooded area. It was late at night, and a grayish-looking creature was wobbling down the middle of the road, size of a large raccoon. It didn't look like anything I have seen even in pictures. I turned the car around to get my lights back on, and it was gone. May not exactly fit the title, but when I was a teenager, I worked at a fireworks stand that was run by my friend's family. It was in a rural area. They owned a few acres of land, had the fireworks tent at the front of the property, and the house towards the back, but no lights in between. My friend's mother would prepare dinner for all the workers, and we'd take turns going back to the house for dinner. One night, I was going to the house for dinner by myself. I felt something on my arm. I thought a bug might have landed on me, but it was really dark, so I couldn't see anything. I stopped walking for a second, then I stared, and hearing this low, raspy breathing right next to me. There weren't any people around me, and it didn't sound anything like a bug. It was like a slow, asthmatic wheeze. I started getting really freaked out. I reached my hand down to my arm and felt something larger than I expected. I furiously rubbed my hands all across my body to try and dislodge whatever this thing was, then ran as fast as I could to the house. When I finally got to the safety of the house, I could see a small red mark on my arm, but that was it. To this day, it's probably the most freaked out I've ever been. In Japan, a hotel was abandoned before it was ever finished being built. It only became a cement skeleton, about 5 stories high. It was left that way to eventually mold back into the forest around it. It's an interesting small building to explore. There are halls that are unlevel to the point of hitting your head on the ceiling. Think Willy Wonka. There are stairwells that lead to nothing, and one that leads to an unintentional hole in a cement wall. And on the top floor, but inside, as in under the roof, is an old car all smashed up, with seemingly no reason or method to have been up there. I live next to the woods, like you can literally see it out my window. Well, one night I was sitting on my bed watching TV when a light flashed through my window. I looked around and there was nothing there, so I brushed it off as me being crazy. About 5 minutes later it happened again, so I looked around again and there was still nothing. The third time it happened, I was getting ticked off and assumed it was one of my stupid neighbor's kids who always messes around. I opened my window to tell them to piss off, but as I looked closer, the only thing I saw was a black purse I had lost about a week ago when I went clubbing. Something in my head was screaming to get away from the window, so I shut it and closed the curtains, locking my bedroom door and calling my dad. He came over immediately and grabbed the bag from outside, as well as locking all the windows and doors and checking the whole house. We looked through the purse and nothing had been taken, but there was also a small note crumpled in it that said something along the lines of, "Watch your back." My dad called the cops, who also did a full sweep of the house and took the bag back with them. The next morning, they found a flashlight and a backpack, which had a small collection of pictures of me that had been taken over what looked to be the course of a year. Never had anything like that happen again. Weird. Well, that certainly fits the bill of creepy for sure, even if you weren't in the woods. But, wow, pretty wild. Probably going to get buried in the comments, but there's a little copse of trees between a wood shop and my house. Not enough to even be a small forest, and my family owns the land. Most of the time, it's just my family and I walking the path that goes around. This was 4 years ago, I think. I was walking home and saw something shiny in one of the trees. Someone had hung a big mirror, about a meter tall and a third meter wide, about 20-25 feet up in the air. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Most of my relatives had, but we didn't know who put it up. It stayed there about a year until the hurricane sent it somewhere, probably shattered into 1,000 pieces. In Wales, more like a story of what I didn't see, but still, I was 13 years old and lived in a tiny little village, and one day my dog escaped the back garden and went on an adventure by himself. Concerned about him getting into a field with livestock, I went looking for him around the village and remembered there was a patch of woodland up the hill that I'd never been to before. I could imagine the dog would love it there, so I went to check it out. I reached the woods and began to call out the dog's name, hoping he'd come bounding out of the woods, but no sign, so I went further in. I came to a pretty large clearing, and suddenly I felt a little creeped out. I suddenly didn't want to call out for the dog anymore and thought I should be getting home. I'd left the clearing and began to hurry back the way I came. Only this time I could hear something. There were very clear sounds of footsteps in the dry leaves following behind me, and I mean right behind me, as though someone was walking close enough for me to touch them, only there was nothing there. I kept stopping to look around and the footsteps would quickly stop as well. My skin was crawling, but I had a strong sense that I shouldn't run, so forced myself to keep walking calmly, but I was completely terrified. I managed to walk about 10 steps with the mysterious sound keeping pace until my nerve went and broke into a mad run. The worst part is that the moment I ran, I heard a weird, high-pitched little giggle coming from behind me. I got the hell out of there and never went back. The dumb dog was waiting for me, having made his way home. I'm glad he didn't go into the woods. Might have been dog-napped by the pixies. We, my friends and I, heard a rumor of a haunted plantation in the woods. After a while of searching and asking around about it, we located it. The story was, it was a plantation with a cruel owner. There was a slave rebellion, and the plantation owner's family was killed, along with the plantation owner. Eventually, the townsfolk mobbed up and they attacked the plantation to smash the rebellion. The leader of the rebellion was supposedly a large black man, and a large black figure was supposedly sighted many times there. It was definitely creepy as F. There was a big 2-story home with 5 smaller homes off to the side and an old barn. One of the buildings had old baby clothes in it. Another had hay all over the floor. The big house had a large kitchen and living room. There was at least 4 bedrooms upstairs and 2 downstairs. The back half of the big house was falling in. I lived on a large cattle station in NSW, Australia until I was 16. A few years before we left, my dad and I were out looking for a few lost cattle in the back paddocks, which back onto quite steep rocky mountains. We were crossing a shallow creek when our horses started snorting and getting flighty. There was movement above us, high up in the trees. My horse started rearing, and just as Dad reached over to grab my reins to settle the horse down, something big and gray dropped from the trees right in between us. Our horses took off in opposite directions. It took all my strength to pull my horse up. Dad eventually came to me and was quite anxious about getting us away from there. I asked him, "What's wrong? What was it?" "It was a roo," he said. It had been gutted and dead a while by the smell. He threw another look over his shoulder and got us moving a bit quicker. I heard him mutter to himself, "How the hell did it get up that bloody tree?" He never went out without a gun after that day. These stories about big cats out in the Australia bush, it's the only explanation we could ever come up with. Alright, so nature experts, what do you think? Definitely a big cat or something else? Thoughts? I recently bought about 9 acres of woods to use for camping. When I bought the property, it was the dead of winter in Iowa, so I couldn't really walk around and scout it out as much as I would have liked. The woods are badly overgrown, and this spring I started working to clear some trails and areas for picnics, etc. There are 2 old barns down in the woods, with a nice little area between them. So I took my walk-behind brush mower down there, and spent an afternoon cutting down the waist-high grass and saplings. After a few hours, I was left with a nice, clear little spot. The next day I went down to show the area to my wife, and there was probably 80% complete deer skeleton, bleached white, right in the middle of the area. There's no way I mowed and walked over it without seeing it, and obviously the deer hadn't just died. There are bits of it still down there, several months later. This happened when I was about 11 at a friend's farm. It's a little different to the question because I can explain it. We were pretending to be like explorers or something, wandering into the woods when, in the distance, we see a very large black animal, a panther. Even though it was relatively far away, we were horrified. We only saw it for a little while, then it wandered off. The strangest part of this is that I live in Australia, which panthers aren't native, so we were really confused. However, after some research, we found out that there used to be circuses that would come with all different animals including panthers, and apparently there were many reports of animals escaping, and also many sightings in the past. This is a story of my father when he was just a teenager. In high school, my father had to walk for at least 5 kilometers every day to get to school. This was in the 1960s. Motor vehicles are very rare in the rural areas. He always took a shortcut through the woods. One morning, a farmer saw him just walking back and forth through an area in the woods. The farmer shouted to call his attention, and my father snapped back to reality. My father claimed that rows of very tall trees had been blocking his path, and he could not find a way out of the woods. That was not the first time it happened to someone in that area. It was believed that playful spirits trick people by giving them illusions. Some accounts even say that people got lost in the woods for days, only to be found asleep or dead on the ground. I passed through the area several times. It's mostly rice paddies now, but I never experienced something similar. When I was 11, my school hosted a camping trip for a group of 12. I was one of the lucky few chosen to go on said trip. When we arrived at the campsite, the boys and girls are put into separate tents in separate areas. The bathrooms were down a hill, and if you had to go to the bathroom at night, you were that nature is the bathroom. Well, on the third night, I had to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. I got up and out of the tent and walked behind a tree to use the bathroom. Immediately, I felt something or someone around me. Keep in mind, I have no light source. It was all pitch black, and I couldn't see anything more than a few feet in front of me. I remember hearing a growling sound. That sound was enough for me to book it, and I ran straight for the tent. I alerted one of the camp counselors about what had happened, and they went to check it out. As they come back, I see them go on their walkie-talkies and alert the other counselors of scratches on a tree. They told my group to go back to sleep, and so we did. In the morning, I was still aware of, after a sleepless night, a few minutes before I knew everyone would wake up, I snuck out of the tent and went to go see what had happened. When I got to the spot I had just been a few hours ago, I saw claw marks on a couple of trees. To this day, I have no clue what made that growling sound, nor do I know what made the claw marks on the trees. My parents have told me this story many times throughout my life, so I'll try to paraphrase it as best I can. It was 1972. My mom and her best friend, my godmother, were on a double date at one of those cheesy makeout spots you see in movies. It was about 11 p.m. and they were parked next to one other car only. Everything was great until they were getting ready to leave, and the 4 people in the car all saw what they described as a giant ball of light, almost like fire. It was about 12 feet tall and equally as wide, and coming at them quickly. My mom said it felt like a scene from a horror movie trying to start their car in time. It continued to chase them until they reached the city limits, and then it just disappeared. The kicker was that my mom's future husband, my dad, was in the car next to them, but neither of them had met each other at that point. It wasn't until 20 years down the road when the 3 of them, my mom, her best friend, and my dad, were all swapping stories, and they realized they were parked next to each other that night and saw the exact same thing. Grew up in the woods of New England. My home and all of my neighbors' houses were built on former wetlands, and so there was a lot of undeveloped land that made up our backyard, aka a couple of acres of dense woods, complete with creeks, streams, small stone walls, and stuff like that. My brothers and I would go exploring in the woods as children, and there was just weird stuff everywhere. From seemingly new trash, beer cans, and milk jugs with recent sell-by dates, all the way to rusting car parts that had to have been there for years. This all took place in the late 90s, so we weren't strapped with cell phones or anything like that. The weirdest thing that happened one day was I was out with my younger brother. I was 11 or 12 and he was 10. I was walking back toward our house because I was tired when I came across a man in the woods. I didn't want to freak my brother out, so I just kept beckoning to get here right now, and we need to go home. He never saw the man. I'm assuming it was just a neighbor that was doing exploring of his own, or could have been someone planning for more homes to put in and was looking at boundary lines. But I'd never seen anyone back there before, and I don't really know what would have happened had I not made it clear that we were leaving now and then booked it home with my brother in tow. A cougar in the woods of southern North Carolina. I was a younger teenager, left a bonfire around dusk and walked to the tree line to pee. In the sandhills of North Carolina, there's this kind of brown, stringy grass that grows everywhere. Anyway, in the grass about 30 feet away, just standing and watching, was the biggest cat I've ever seen outside of the zoo. Like, way too big to be a bobcat. Its head and shoulders were above the grass. The color was almost a perfect blend with the grass. I was scared and started to run, but it just slow blinked at me, turned around and slowly walked away into the woods. Of course, nobody believed me, and wildlife experts say that the creature has been extinct for a century, so who knows what it really was. My ex lived near Wenatchee, Washington, surrounded by trails. We decided to go check a trail at the end of her road, past a couple orchards, leading up a hill through some brush. Well, not even 20 feet in, just past a bush, was a fresh deer kill, guts all splayed out. Now that area is well known for cougars, and the state is known for serial killers. Either way, the scene felt unsafe, seeing how fresh it looked, so we got out of there and went to another trail elsewhere. I'm from Australia. Me and a mate were out 4x4ing in a pine forest around 3 to 4 p.m., which it's still fairly daylight. If you could imagine lots of steep up and down hills with barely any dirt trail to drive on and a heap of pine trees. We were heading down around the middle of the forest down a hill, and it flattens out for a while. I'd imagine we would have been in the middle of the forest at that stage. All of a sudden, it goes nearly pitch black. I shit bricks, cause it's like, what the F? Drove about 100 meters toward the other side, and there's this man in a hoodie picking mushrooms, nearly pitch black, and he's picking effing mushrooms with like an old mesh type brown saggy bag. It was really creepy, cause we couldn't see his face as it was too dark, as his face was either fairly back in the hoodie or had no damn face. But it was like icky creepy vibes, so we effed off, and really quick. Few days go past, get a few of the boys cause we told them about it being so dark, then the weird bloke, so a group of about 3 to 4 youths, and be less creepy with a group, couldn't find the damn thing for the effing life of us. Mind you, this forest isn't huge, however, we covered enough ground to go through the whole forest. Couldn't find it at all. No explanation to this day. Camping with the Cub Scouts. This was probably 2009 or so, way out in Bum F, Pennsylvania. Nice campsite area with a huge cabin but undeveloped forest for miles outside of the cleared areas. One night, we went on some sort of candlelight vigil walk or hike. Huge single file line, and all the troops, or whatever the hell they're called, are together. I remember feeling like I had to look at this thing, like I was compelled to by nature itself. There was this tall, probably 6-foot bunny man. That's the best way to describe it, and had this really malevolent twisted face and a pair of real beaten up looking ears. Like if a skinny ass grown man was wearing the suit from Donnie Darko, except it was pink, and he was walking with this really unnatural gait where he seemed to be making conscious decisions to independently move his muscles, almost like whatever it was trying to imitate human movement. It was very unnatural and surreal. And for the brief 5 to 10 seconds I watched it, I just had this awful feeling that something was terribly wrong. I looked away for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me, and when I looked back where I saw it, it was just gone. This was a very moonlit night, and with the candles and torches, you could see out quite a bit before things got dark. I've never mentioned this story to anybody up until now. Looking back, it was probably some asshole looking to terrify some children on a scouting trip. However, I still remember how wrong that thing seemed. It could only be described as uncanny and definitely unnatural. I was living in the woods on some state land for a little while a few years ago, as I was out of options. I could hear cars approaching this stop from a while away, and there weren't more than a couple houses within walking distance, so I usually knew when there were people around. Yet, near where I found an old cobblestone foundation, about 50 yards from my camp, about every night I saw what looked like an oil lantern, where a match would strike, even in the wind. The lantern would light, the match would go out, and then the lantern would bob forward for about 15 steps, and then the light would disappear. I'm not all about ghosts and shit, but I still have no explanation for that. When I was younger, in the woods near my parents' house, I saw a man with a rifle sitting on an old tree. There really is nothing weird about it. People go hunting all the time in those woods, and I was on the path they used to come back to their cars. But the way he was holding the rifle while sitting, the way he stood up in panic right as my dog started trotting his way, and the fact that he was clearly crying felt weird on the spot. He waved at me, said something I didn't hear, and I passed him saying hello. It took me 25 minutes of walking before I realized I might have interrupted his suicide attempt. I tried going back, but he wasn't there, and told my parents about it. They called the police, but nothing ever came out of it. Maybe I was wrong though. Maybe he wasn't holding the rifle like I remember, and maybe he wasn't crying, but it felt really weird. Stopped at a coworker's house one night after a late shift, around 2:30 a.m., to drop off something she had forgotten. I didn't know exactly where I was, but was familiar with the town and knew the highway I take home was very close. So I turned on the GPS just to get me back to the highway. Sometime after 3 a.m., the GPS bugged out and started leading me in circles before finally spitting me out on some back road in a wooded area, which I drove on for a bit until I saw a man just walking in circles next to the road. I'm a young woman with small stature and have seen enough movies to urge me to just keep driving, but kept watching him in my rear view. When I looked back to the road, I had to slam on the brakes because in front of me was an albino deer just standing there. It looked up, then walked away, and I kept driving. I saw lights behind me, but by this point, I was looking out for more deer or weird things and ignored them as they kept getting brighter, and I thought, this guy is getting really close. So I looked up and there was nothing behind me, no cars in sight. This happened 2 more times. I still didn't know where I was and was about to call my boyfriend when I made a turn and came out right in the town where I live. When I got home, my boyfriend told me he heard the sound of our front door opening and somebody coming inside twice while I was gone. But he checked the house and didn't find anybody. It was a weird night, and I don't think either of us slept very well. I've been to this girl's house twice after the incident, and both times my GPS has taken me right to the highway like normal.